everyone, it's Jessica. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to discuss author spaces, reviewer spaces, and fanish spaces in general. This is coming up specifically because about a month ago, Daniel Greene put out an advanced copy of his book, which is released, called A Breach of Peace. One of his beta readers gave him a 4-star review. What they mentioned, since his novella heavily features police brutality and it being a divine right or justified by God, it wasn't going to be for everyone, and that some of those themes weren't handled as carefully as they could be. And all of that is valid criticism. The problem is that Daniel Greene responded to that review directly in an open comment and started an open dialogue. And there's been a lot of dissent about whether or not he should have done that, when it's appropriate to talk to reviewers, when it's not, what the job of a reviewer is. And I think all of these topics are really valid, especially for me and my channel, where most of my work here on YouTube is book related from a reviewer standpoint. But I do actually have a book out, and in theory I could be responding to reviews on my YouTube channel as well. So we should discuss where I am with that process, what I would feel comfortable doing or not doing, and why. And also we should discuss about whether or not I think that authors that I review should be responding to my reviews and why that would or wouldn't be appropriate. So let's go ahead and dive into this. The accepted status quo: reviewers write the reviews specifically for other people who would consume that media. So it's not for authors, and authors should not respond to a reviewer. And many reviewers even feel sort of threatened if an author does respond to them. Now, there are outliers, reviewers who tag authors and consistently bug them and look for attention, but this is a minority opinion in reviewers, specifically if the reviewer is posting their opinion or their feelings in a space that's dedicated just to other readers or other people who might be interested in a creative work. Now, there's a difference between being a reviewer and being a fanish person. A fanish person can write a review, and when they do within a reviewer space, they should not expect creator interaction. But a fanish person can also write a review or a critique outside of a reviewer space, and in that case, they might be looking for reviewer reactions, they might be looking for further follow-up and detail from a creator. And that's part of what muddies the line a little bit, is that reviewers and fanish people can be the same, but are often different, and their goals are different. So you have to be really careful as a creator to make sure that you're observing what kind of space your review is written in and whether or not it's appropriate for you to respond. As to why there are boundaries like this, there's a couple reasons. First of all, if you have an author continually responding to your reviews, it might censor your reviews. It might close down discourse that needs to happen with other people who are consuming what you wrote. Because once you've published a work, it's no longer yours or just for you, it's for everyone. It's in the public eye. And we need to have discussions about what kind of themes other people saw, how other people interpreted this work. And even if it's not how an author intended the work to be interpreted, there's value in seeing other people's experience being brought to the table. As an author, you don't want to step into that conversation. You don't want to shut it down or silence it. The part of an author, if any, in a reviewer space is just to listen. And a lot of people even recommend that authors don't look at reviewer spaces, they don't check reviews. And part of that is because authors can become defensive or it can be too much for them. And that's fine. A little bit this is about knowing yourself, your boundaries, and your own personal limits. Some authors are going to want to read reviews. They're going to want to stop and think about the kind of feedback they're getting. They're going to want to see if their expected feedback is the same. They might even pick up new notes or ideas for future works. And some authors are going to be hurt by negative reviews and feedback, or they're going to be frustrated by it because reviewers are not editors. So they might say, I didn't like this part of the book, or I didn't like this theme. And then they just stop there. They're like, this theme was unpleasant and I don't want to read things like that. But if you work with an editor, they'll say this theme is unpleasant, and then they'll give you ways to fix it, ways to work around it. It's totally different than a review. And of course, some authors or writers like myself, I will give a different kind of plethora of reviews. Sometimes I don't know how to correct a theme, or I don't care to correct a theme. And other times I do a whole workshop it and I talk about all the little things that I didn't like and what you could do to either erase them, change them, or bring the work up to be more coherent, which some authors like that kind of thing, some authors don't. When I create a workshop, it's not specifically for that author. It's just for us to look at storytelling in general and to see what we could do to improve stories, at least from my perspective. But a reviewer is not required to do that. And if you're a writer and you're used to getting a lot of feedback, either from betas, critique partners, fellow writers, editors, sometimes you fall into this mode where anytime someone says, I didn't like something or this didn't work, you're expecting them to follow it up with a bunch of different other things that they could do to fix that. And it can be really frustrating then to interact with reviewers. All the more reason not to, in my opinion, and to keep in mind that that's not a reviewer's job or place. If they do that, it's often, like in my case, on an intellectual level, because I have thoughts and feelings I want to express, because I have ideas, and I want to continue to push the discourse in this way. That's not the only way to push a reviewer discourse. It can just be, this theme exists, I don't like it, and I'm not going to read books like this, or themes like this in a book really ruin the whole experience, or I don't like this kind of character, and they shouldn't exist, or these elements were troubling for me for these reasons, and then not discuss how to fix those troubling elements. Another thing for an author to consider when they publicly address a review, they're sort of calling out a single individual person, and they're often calling that person out to their larger audience. So it can be intimidating or dangerous for a reviewer that an author accidentally puts on blast. And they might not even meant it that way. They might have genuinely wanted further conversation. They might have just thought that the feedback was interesting. It could even be critical feedback that they just say is valid. The tone of the response from the creator isn't going to change, that somewhere in their larger fan base is probably a group of people who are going to run to defend them no matter what. And they're going to attack that one individual they put in blast. So there's an unequal power situation going on. It ends up being to the reviewer's detriment. And you don't want to do that to a person. I mean, that person, whether they gave you a great review or a terrible review, read your book or consumed your media because it interests them. There's something in the summary or the idea that they really wanted to get into and they wanted to like. If they left a critical response, it's because in some way it didn't execute how they thought it would execute. That's not their fault. It's not necessarily the author's fault either, but you shouldn't put them in a situation that could be dangerous to them or that could feel threatening or scary to them because they were excited to view your work and it didn't pan out the way they hoped. Feedback, whether it's positive or negative, is all good. The fact that you have a review or that you have someone who wants to talk about your work is great. It means that they felt something, even if it wasn't what you intended. And from that perspective, I think authors and creators should be more excited that this discourse is happening. And creators do have places where they can respond to feedback. I think the general concern is to specifically call out an individual reviewer, but if you're seeing a repeating trend while you're reading your review, if that's something you choose to do, then you can talk about that in like a YouTube video or a panel or an interview or on your Patreon or Discord. There's a lot of places you can do that without ever specifically calling to individual reviewers or examples, and you can stick to individual themes or areas that you either didn't realize were in your book, or that's not how you meant things, or maybe you just want to clarify your own stance. Like, yes, this character is this way, but just because I made a fictional character like this doesn't mean that I think these things. And you can see in these areas of the text where I tried to separate or to make this person's view not seem correct. Or you could even just say like, hey, I fell short. Like, that criticism is valid. That's not what I intended, but I definitely see how that's read. Some people like to interact like that and some people don't. If you don't want to address those situations, that's fine too. I think the main issue is that spaces like Amazon or Goodreads in your reviews is not the place for an author to respond. And reposting those reviews to like your Twitter or your Imager or your Facebook or whatever is also not how these critiques should come about. Even within Goodreads, there's a place where if the reviewer wanted to interact with an author, they could. They can ask questions of the author and the author can respond. The place just doesn't happen to be within the reviews of a specific book. All of that said, there are some gray areas between what's a reviewer space and what's an author space and how it's appropriate to interact. And one of those places actually is YouTube. Both Booktube and AuthorTube sort of came up at the same time, and there's a lot of crossover between the two. I'm actually a good example of this. I am a independently published author who has a YouTube channel, and this channel was originally additional content for my book, and it sort of crossed over into more Booktube-y kinds of things instead of writing process kind of things. So some of what I'm saying about different authors, it can be confusing. Am I talking about them as a peer and we're having a peer conversation, or am I talking about them as a reviewer and I'm reviewing the book? And I think it can be very confusing where I stand or where other fellow individuals who have both written a book and who create YouTube content, where do we fall? Are we in a reviewer safe space where authors shouldn't respond? Or are we authors? If you are a writer, you have a hard time letting go of that desire to critique, to nitpick, to edit, and that kind of feedback is often not really the job of a reviewer. I totally understand if an author doesn't want to interact with any of my media and they think that it's more like a review than not, or if they did want to interact, they'd want to take it through a private channel, and I'd be up for that too if they felt like they wanted to reach out and discuss something with me. As to whether it's appropriate or not for me to be critiquing published works, I am doing it in a way to further discussion. I'm not critiquing the author, their ability to craft a story. That's never how it's intended. And I'm not telling them what they could or should do in the future. I guess I'm giving avenues that possibly they could use, but they don't have to. When you look at a published work, you're not really directing that feedback to the person who created it. They've already gone through a whole process and are satisfied with where they're at and feel that they met the intentions and goals that they set for themselves. But I think if you're looking to create stories and you're looking to see where the future evolution of storytelling is going, or how to better tighten your own stories, or what was or wasn't working, the only way you can do that really is to look at published works. I can't critique works that are in progress unless someone gives them to me, and even then, I wouldn't want to create a public place where I was critiquing those works without that person's permission, because works in progress are very personal. They are in a period of adjustment. It's not really my place to share a work that's in progress that I might be helping a peer with. So I think in my channel, when I do something like Workshopped It, I really am coming from a reviewer space, and it probably makes sense that authors don't want to talk to me. And when I do similar things behind the scenes with writing friends and peers, I'm coming at it from a writing perspective. And even though some of the critiques and feedback I'm giving is the same, which can be very confusing, the intended audience is really different. And I don't think giving unsolicited critique is appropriate either. I think authors and other creators understand that there's larger craft discussions happening and that you use published works to make those points, but I don't think that they necessarily like to engage in those conversations themselves. So now that we've established some general boundaries for both creators and reviewers and how they should interact, if at all, let's go ahead and talk a little bit specifically about the Daniel Greene situation. First of all, if you don't know Daniel Greene or the situation at all, you should be aware that he is a fantasy booktuber and independent author, and that he recently released his first novella, Breach of Peace, and Breach of Peace is intended to set up a larger world that he plans to write full novels in. I have followed him for 2, maybe 3 years, pretty much once I realized that I was going to self-publish an urban fantasy novel, and I was looking for booktube creators who focused in fantasy. Daniel Greene came up right away. He's one of the largest booktubers on the platform, and he's also probably the largest fantasy booktuber that I know of on this platform. So it's hard not to know him if you're in the fantasy subgenre and you follow people on YouTube. I think Daniel and I like very different kinds of fantasy stories. Based off of his reviews and his reading list, he reads a lot of fantasy that I'm only like lukewarm interested in. And I'm sure the same is true on his side as well. But it's really interesting to watch him and to see what his takes are, because we both love fantasy so much and we come at it and have different interests within that subgenre. It's just great to see the variety of things that are within fantasy. And one of the things that he is always encouraging, and part of this probably comes from him being an independent author, is that there should be more conversations between reviewers and authors. And I don't necessarily disagree, because one of the main reasons I write is because I do want to start conversations and dialogues with people about different themes, ideas, things that I've seen, or concepts. And I want to do it in a safer way than just discussing the real world. And for me, fiction is one of those safer ways because I can create a whole narrative, a whole set of characters and casts, and a whole situation that is just a little bit unreal, or a lot of it unreal, depending on which parts we're talking about. And that creates kind of like a distance and a safety that makes it easier for us to discuss the topics. So definitely I'd want to respond to reviewers too. I understand his impulse there, but I think he hasn't fully considered the potential danger to a reviewer when you call them out. The fact that a lot of reviewers don't approach reviews the same way that I think maybe he and I both do, with the idea of creating dialogue and talking about different ways to uplift a work or to continue the discourse in other works. And I also think that to a certain level, he has something to gain from interacting with his reviewers. I mean, he started by posting on Goodreads, and he ended up creating a whole YouTube video specifically around this one review. So he used this for content, which I think is an ethical problem in and of itself, because even though this particular reviewer seemed okay with the discourse happening and seemed comfortable enough-ish with what was going on, I'm sure that they got hit social media-wise with a bunch of people talking to them, and especially after the YouTube video that Daniel Greene did. And on top of that, I think the YouTube video was really misleading and patronizing and didn't really address the points that needed to be addressed. The first question is like, this guy's a beta reader. In theory, you really trust and know him, and then you publicly called him out, and that's kind of weird. I don't like that. And also, it was a 4-star review. He had one theme he didn't like, and you couldn't let it go. To me, that's not a good look on the author, right? Like, if you give me a 4-star review and you're like, I didn't like thing X in this book, and because this thing is so prevalent in the book, some readers are not going to like this, or they're going to have a very visceral reaction to the story because of this thing. To me, that's a great review. It tells people what to expect in the book, and it turns people away who wouldn't be interested in the book, which is perfect, because I don't want someone to read the book who doesn't want to, you know? So I think the reviewer did a great job. And the other thing is, like, when he did start to engage with that reviewer, he was like, what kind of feedback could you give me? Which again is not a reviewer's job. That is a thing that you and your beta readers should have done together. It's not something for your ARC reader to do. At this point, it's too late. I can see something and not like it and just point out that I don't like it and not necessarily know how to fix it. The first way we go through fixing things is making people aware that there's a problem. And I don't think that we should be telling people not to speak out if you don't know how to fix a problem. It takes all of us working together. First, we have to be aware there's a problem, and then we can talk about different ways to fix it. And the other issue is, somehow in his YouTube video, he managed to come off even more condescending to his reviewers while he was validating the feedback, saying like, hey, that review is valid and you're allowed to feel that way. Continually said you're allowed. And I didn't like that. Like, we needed his permission to interpret his work. Like, my overall view on books is, if I read it, my interpretation is the correct interpretation for me. It might not be what the author intended, but it's too late for that. We don't all have the same experience. We're not all going to take the same thing from the same book. And part of what's interesting about that is because a book is a very specific experience, and seeing multiple points of view about something that's objectively the same is part of what's interesting. And every single point of view about a book is valid based off of that person's life experience, where they were mentally when they read the book, a whole bunch of other stuff that goes into that. I would never say you're allowed to feel that way, or like, I'm granting you permission to feel that way. I found it really offensive. In fact, I was so offended by that video. I had been a little bit on the fence about how much I sympathize with Daniel Greene's situation, whether or not I felt he had just got up in his feelings and made a mistake, which is more permissible for independent authors to do than mainstream authors, because they are a one-man show. They do have to market, publish, write, promote, continue to push that book. Daniel Greene does have to make some sort of YouTube content about his book. It was probably always in his plan to do that. Maybe it was even in his plan to start reading reading some of the different ARC reviews he got before he knew what those reviews would be, just to be as like a little taste, a little get you excited for the novella I have that's coming out. All of that makes sense content-wise, but doesn't necessarily make sense as far as an ethical thing to do to the people you asked to review your book. The way he presented it felt really false, but it also felt like it was a great way to drive attention. As it is, like, I'm sitting here, I'm talking about his book when I would have never talked about his book or read it. It doesn't appeal to me, even though it's a fantasy story. It's not the kind of fantasy I read, right? So we just continue this bubble of media and attention. But at the same time, it's hard not to, because I want to discuss this. This is an interesting thing that came up, and it made me question a lot about what my goals were with my channel, what I would do in his situation, what I think is objectively ethically correct to do, all of those things, and why I think the way I do. And in my case, I think because when an author responds specifically to an individual reviewer, the author always has a larger audience. They're always punching down, and I don't think that you should punch down. So I am always going to be on the reviewer side, even though I think there are a couple things a reviewer should not do. They should never attack a creator personally. They should always focus on the content that they're consuming and what they did or didn't like about that content. Or if they're focusing on a creator's larger body of work, they should focus on that creator's larger body of work and not necessarily on the creator as a person. There are some cases we're talking about an author's influences or where you think different themes came from makes sense, but it's a very thin line. And I do think if you're going to write that kind of review or that kind of analysis of someone's work, you have to be very careful and thoughtful. And I do think reviewers in general would benefit from always considering that the author might read their review. I know some reviewers have said if they thought that an author would read anything negative from them, that they would never create a review at all. And I'm sure that I have some reviews that are too salty for quite a few authors out and existing right now on Goodreads. But I do always try to approach it where I'm honest about what I like and what I didn't like. And at the same time, I don't say anything that I think is too mean. And that can be hard, especially if you're trying to create entertaining content. It's always pushing you to be more extreme. It's pushing you into hyperbole, into excited outbursts, into like rant territory. As a reviewer, you have to pull back from that. You have to say, is this really what I want to do? Is this really who I want to be? Even online, even as an exaggerated person, like a fun character. So the reviewer does have some of those, especially if they're giving more public-facing reviews. And a fan person in the community in general, they should always be considering like, where was this media going and what was its intention, and did it meet those intentions even if it didn't meet my expectations? An author ultimately almost always has more power than a reviewer, and because of that, they should be very careful. And they should consider whether they're doing something because they want to have a discourse, because they feel attacked, because they think it'll be good clickbait, good media that will continue to draw people into their book and reading it. You know, there's a lot of factors driving a person, and you should make sure before you respond or interact that you are doing the right thing for the right reason. Anyways, I'm sorry that this kind of opinion has come out so far from the actual scandal, but I actually was very conflicted when it first came out about where I thought I landed with it and why I felt that way. And I had to really listen to the larger conversation going on before I could figure out where I stood and how this impacts me potentially now and in the future. And really right now, I'm discussing it more from a reviewer standpoint, even though I am an independent author, because not that many people have read my book. Even though I would love it if it just became the bestseller in the world, I know that's probably not in the cards. Even as a reviewer that would welcome author interaction, I recognize that's unlikely and probably not something an author would want to do in the case of the kind of content I create, because it's not all glowing, happy reviews, right? Like, even in things I like a lot, I have critical feedback. And I can understand why an author, if they're done with something, doesn't want to go over critical elements like that, like in a here's some things you could do next time, or here's some things you could have done in this specific work. I know that some people, they can't take that kind of information and transfer it to the next work, or they don't want to, and all of that's cool. And we should just respect in general where people are at, what kind of space we're in, and what sort of discourse we should be encouraging, and what our place is in the discourse. Sometimes your place is to talk, and sometimes your place is to listen. It takes both of those to actually have a conversation. Thanks for taking interest in this video. If you liked it, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. This is sort of new for me. I don't usually do this kind of meta content. Most of the time, it's more like reviews or storytelling critiques and a fantasy science fiction focus. But I hope you liked it, and if there's more ideas like this you want to listen to, go ahead, give me a comment down below. If you want to listen to me talking about evaluating and pulling apart different science fiction and fantasy books, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Thank you guys so much. I do weekly videos that come out on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Central Time. I'll see you there. Bye!